All right, so just as a reminder, everybody's aware we have our 5th and final exam tomorrow. There's going to be no cheat sheet for this or note card or anything like that. You're just going to take it like you did the first couple exams. And what we did last time in office hours is we were going through the topics and learning mod or questions, and we got through question 4, and we can then pick up with question 5 unless anybody has a more specific question that they would like answered. So someone asked in the chat, could we go over some of the examples of the math questions we can expect to see on the exam using the formulas? And before I continue, I need to check something real quick on Canvas.
Did you say that we weren't allowed to have a note card?
That's what I just want to double check, because I think, did I say that you could use a note card for the formulas on this exam, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so scratch what I said. After I said it out loud, it sounded wrong, so that's why I was going to go look back at the announcements. So yes, you can use a note card to put the equations on. You can use the front and the back of the note card. It's different than the cheat sheet that you can't put anything from the cog books on there, but you can put any equations on there. And we will go over some of the equations. We can look at some of the activities specifically. I think it comes up in question like 9 or something. So why don't we wait until, question 10 talks about the efficiencies. So why don't we just go in order, and when we get to number 10, we can go to those specific modules, and we will definitely cover the calculations. All right. So chemical formulas, that's a fair question. They're asking, are chemical formulas allowed? So that would be like the C6H12, the glucose molecule. For those, no, those are not chemical, those are not part of the calculations, those are chemical formulas. So those will not be allowed on the note card. All right, so why don't we jump back into the questions then? So number 5 says, explain how scientists identify hotspots of biodiversity. So they do this a few different ways. So why don't we go ahead and kind of list them off and discuss them. Someone asked when the extra credit will be applied. I will be doing that the last week of the course. And the way that I'm going to do that, that's a good question to bring up at this time too. The way I'll do that is I'm going to add 10 points, up to 10 points of, they call them fudge points on your exams. So I'll go through on your exam 4 and your grade will be increased by 10, up to 10 points, how many points you did during the discussion session. So there will not be another extra credit discussion board for exam 5. Yeah, if you got 100% on the previous exam, it would score you at 110% or 110 points. So you'll get the maximum no matter what.
Yeah.
All right. Any other questions about the exam or the note card or the extra credit or anything like that about the course? Okay, and if more questions come up, feel free to chime in, but I'll just jump back to question number 5 then. So this one again said, explain how scientists identify hotspots of biodiversity. So what are a few of the ways that they do this? What do they look for in the habitat when they're identifying a hotspot for biodiversity? So someone said isolated areas that contain large proportion of endemic species. Locations with high species richness. So large proportion of the world's species located in relatively small proportion of the world's land. So areas containing at least 1,500 endemic species, 34, okay. So I think we got the some good points out of that. So the first one that I have in my notes for that is what some people said in the chat is finding areas with high numbers of endemic species. So we covered that. Focus on areas that have high species richness without a focus on endemic species. So that would be like the areas that somebody mentioned where you have a high number of species in a small area. That could be an area of focus, and it doesn't maybe matter if there's endemic species or not. And then the last one I found was prioritize species-rich locations facing the highest current or projected threats of species extinctions, such as locations that have or are projected to have a rapidly growing human population. So we got the first two pretty well, and then the third one was just looking at areas that might be potentially under construction. So something that comes to mind is the rainforest. If you know that there's going to be a large area that has high species richness that might come under logging or construction of some sort, scientists might label that as a hotspot for biodiversity. So why is there no one single answer for this? So some said there's a lot of factors that come into play. I would agree. And then someone asked, are the specific cogbooks statements valid, like 34 areas, or is that too specific? I won't ask for anything that specific on the exam. So about 34 areas, or somebody mentioned 1,500 endemic plant species. So those numbers are good to know maybe, but a little too specific for the exam questions that you'll see. But the patterns are correct, high number of endemic species. And then someone else said, because of people's different perspective, they should set high priorities. So ecological, economic, or social, difference in opinions of what is valued in a country. Yeah, this one is kind of where I was going, is different countries have different laws, right? So politics play actually a big role. In the United States, it might be easy to get something listed as endangered or biodiversity hotspot, whereas in another country, it might be more difficult, or vice versa. It really depends on kind of the local politics. And within the United States, it could be on a state level, it could be on a federal level, or even a county level. So it's really just dependent on the local area and what those laws are, how they would be classified as a biodiversity hotspot. Scientists might classify them that, argue about it, but politicians might disagree, and legally they may or may not be accepted as a biodiversity hotspot and may or may not be protected. So I think that covers number 5 pretty well, unless anybody else has any questions or comments about it. All right, before we get to number 6, I'm going to pause real quick and respond to an email. So give me about a minute or so. It's a course email. Let's go ahead and we can continue on with number 6 now. And this one says, describe the major aspects of global change that threaten biodiversity on Earth. And it says climate change, introduced species, overconsumption, and habitat destruction. So why don't we kind of go through these one by one. We'll just start with global climate change. How does this threaten biodiversity on Earth? We got extraction of fossil fuel that contributes to climate change. Someone said pollution. So I think putting those two together is great. Extracting fossil fuels and burning them can cause pollution. Warmer temperatures causing ice caps to melt. And this is great. You're building on each other's answers, right? Because this pollution, or we can refer to them maybe as greenhouse gases, or the greenhouse effect, causes excess gases such as CO2 and carbon monoxide in the environment that does cause pollution and causes warmer temperatures, causing the ice caps to melt. So somebody brought up a specific example about amphibians, how they have limited niches, and I would agree with that, right? They have to be in wetlands of some sort. So if climate change is causing temperatures to rise, it might be causing wetlands to potentially dry up a little bit, and that would lose their habitat. They're also ectotherms, as they pointed out, so they're affected by temperature changes. So if it gets too warm, they have to move out of the area to cooler, more hospitable environments. And since they live in wetlands, they can't just walk down the road or they'll dry out, right? So it could kill, entire wetlands if they can't migrate from one wetland to another, or they don't get some potential help in movement from humans. I think you guys covered that pretty well. We got the greenhouse effect, warmer temperatures is what I got in my notes too. And then the only thing I might add from my notes is it can affect species distributions. And we kind of covered this with the salamander example, but even other species that are more mobile, like birds or maybe deer, if it's too warm for them, they might change their distributions. If it's getting warm, it might force them out of some grassland habitat, and maybe these are deer, and force them more up into the mountain regions. And then that's going to cause them to interact with different plant species, and that environment, may or may not have the food they need. There's going to be a different competition levels, different predation levels. So causing distributions to shift can have kind of a ripple effect on the former and new habitats that these species are moving to. So I think that's pretty good about global climate change. What about introduced species? How does this affect biodiversity?
You could have a situation where a species becomes like they're more of an invasive species, so they outcompete the other animals or plants in the area. So like was it kudzu in the south just annihilate or just takes over everything. And then I think an example they used in Cogbooks was cats, how they're just destructive to the local like birds in the area.
And that's house cats, right?
Correct, domesticated house cats.
Yeah, domesticated house cats, because we increase their population, they do, they wreak havoc on the local bird communities. That's a great example. And someone mentioned they become invasive when prey cannot defend themselves. I'm not sure if that's the exact wording I would use, but I think that's going in the right direction. So the problem with a lot of invasive species is if they are good predators or good competitors, the local species have not had time to evolve with them over centuries or thousands of years or more, and they don't have any like local adaptations or defenses to fight them off. So they can be like the what's the example in the Florida Everglades is the Burmese python. There's no predators there that can really kill an adult python except maybe some of the alligators. So they wreak havoc on all sorts of prey items. Maybe some of the snakes can eat the juvenile pythons, but then pythons can also reproduce either sexually or they could reproduce asexually through parthenogenesis, which just means that a female can have all female offspring and doesn't need to find a mate, which is even worse because with more females than a population, it only needs a couple males or zero males really with them to kind of really grow rapidly. And that's why the python has been such a successful but damaging predator to the Florida Everglades. Yeah, and ultimately then someone said it, introduced species or invasive species tend to disrupt the ecosystem. In my understanding, the only real difference between an introduced species and an invasive species is an invasive species is shown to have a negative effect, where an introduced species is brought in typically by humans, and it may or may not have a negative effect, and it just hasn't been there long enough to really be quantified negatively.
Is that kind of like the example of the wolves introduced in Yellowstone, how they became like a keystone species in that like ecosystem?
Yeah, that was kind of, I can see how we
Because
would
it like
think,
increased the biodiversity because less like smaller animals were preyed on because there were more predators like getting eaten by the wolves themselves.
yeah, I think this fits in that conversation, but I think we'd bring up a new term that we'd have to classify that as reintroduced, right? Because they were native there, humans wiped them out, and then we introduced them or more reintroduced them. But their leaving and coming back did have a big impact on the ecosystem. In that case, the reintroduced species had a positive impact on the ecosystem. And somebody brought up in the chat other positive effects potentially, such as honeybees. And that would be, I think that's good because that is not reintroduced, that is strictly introduced because they're from Europe or from Africa, depending on which strain they are. And we bring them in and they have a positive impact on the local flora because they're really good pollinators. And they have a good impact on humans and domesticated animals that they help pollinate crops. So yeah, that's a good example. You can have positive effects from introduced species, and you can have negative effects. And usually we shift the definition then to invasive species when they have the negative effects. And within the readings of introduced species, they brought up biotic homogenization. What do we mean by that?
Isn't that where over time different areas essentially like their ecosystems just start to look the same because all of the essentially plants and animals are the same, so there's no actual diversity, everything's homogeneous alike.
Yeah, so it talks about the organisms in a region slowly becoming similar over time. So yeah, I think we're on the same page. All right, what about the overconsumption? How does that affect biodiversity? And what do we mean by overconsumption?
Over hunting, overfishing, over like logging trees, plowing grasslands.
Yeah, so the way Cogbooks described it, this is generally a human-caused phenomena, right? Where we go out and overconsume the landscape, and as was just said, that could be overfishing, over harvesting plants, over logging forests, clearing forest for products. Yeah, and ultimately this can drive certain species to endangered levels or to extinction levels. Cogbooks didn't really get into it. They kept this a very human concept, but I would argue that this could be applied potentially to other organisms. The house cat, for example, I would argue would overconsume on birds. They rarely actually eat them. They just kill them because they have the instincts to do so and they're fed on inside the house. We could link this potentially to the Yellowstone system that we talked about when the wolves were removed. Coyotes overconsumed, their numbers grew, and then they overconsumed on a lot of small prey species and drove them to extinction in the area.
And doesn't like in the like agricultural like thing, like it decreases genetic diversity?
Yeah, I think that's fair to make an argument, because what do we think of when we think of crops growing? We think a lot of times monocultures, right? So a single crop in a big area. And what they do to make that, say, a cornfield, for an example, they clear out all sorts of shrubs, bushes, trees, and replace it with one single plant. So yeah, I would say that that could definitely lead to a decrease in biodiversity there. All right, I think that's pretty good for overconsumption, unless anybody has anything they'd like to add. And the last one is habitat loss. How does that affect biodiversity? Yeah, so urbanization is a good example, right? When we clear out maybe a diverse habitat that has some fields, forests, and swampland, and we put in a mall or a subdivision that just has very few or very low diversity, very few like shelters for animals, and it just really decreases that environmental richness or environment richness to decrease biodiversity. So pollution, yeah, oftentimes with urbanization, I would agree, pollution tends to follow. Definitely increases fragmentation, which then I would agree could decrease population size. And ultimately puts, we talked about in the past, having lower numbers or, in a population, that puts them at a higher risk for extinction and higher risk of genetic bottlenecks. Exactly. Yeah, I mean, that's everything I got from my notes. You guys nailed it pretty well there. Are there any other questions or comments about either global climate change, introduced species, overconsumption, or habitat loss? All right, if not, I think we can move on to number 7. This says, summarize which groups of animals and plants are most at threat of extinction from global change. Yeah, so someone said frogs. I think we can be a little more general, and I think Cogworks meant just put it as amphibians. So I'm going to share my screen because this is referring to a specific chart, right? Everybody can see these pie charts here. And what are the different colors telling us? We got 3 colors in the pie charts, right?
The orange is most threatened for extinction. Blue is close to being threatened, and green is least.
Yeah, so orange is the worst color, right? Because those animals are actually threatened. And then blue, they're near threatened. And then green, they seem to be doing okay because they're the least concerned or the least potentially threatened. And we see the highest value of orange, as people have been alluding to, down here in amphibians. So amphibians would probably be, most concerned because about 50% of the entire population of amphibians is either threatened, which is over 40%, or near threatened. And then somebody mentioned followed by conifers, right? Yeah, again, it's over 50% or about 50% is either threatened or near threatened. And then we could maybe make an argument that birds are doing pretty well, right? 77%, we don't really have to worry about. Well, 13% are threatened, so we know we have a very narrow focus on which birds we're going to focus on. So For this one, it's just being able to read these pie charts and answer questions like that. Which of these 6 would be, of most concern to you? Which of these 6 would be of least concern to you? Those types of questions, pretty straightforward, just interpreting these type of data. All right, are there any questions about those charts? It's a good idea to know what the extremes are. But I can check on the exam to see for sure if the charts will be on there or not. So there is a question on the exam directly about these, and it does not give you the chart. So you will have to know which ones are of higher concern or which ones are of lower concern. There's only 6 on there, so it's not too many to have to know. All right, why don't we move on to number 8 then? This one says contrast instrumental value and intrinsic value of biodiversity and give examples of each. So what is instrumental value?
Species that give economic value.
Yeah. What would be an example of this?
Like trees for like wood, like logging.
Exactly, yeah. For animals used for fur, somebody said crops for eating. So anything that you could sell from nature would be an instrumental value, having a monetary economic value. What about an intrinsic value? Someone said species that have inherent value. They don't provide economic benefits. I would agree with those statements. Recognizes that species have inherent value that is not tied to any economic benefit. Then somebody posted an example, bald eagles represent US and freedom. Yeah, so putting an eagle on something and associating with America or our value of freedoms in the United States, I think that's a good example. And this could be large scale, like an entire country like that could maybe even be recognized globally, or it could be on a smaller scale, because there's a lot of Native American or indigenous groups that have similar to the eagle. They have animals represent something that to them very spiritual, but maybe it's on a smaller scale that's not recognized globally. Yes, I think that one's pretty straightforward. You guys seem to be on top of understanding the definitions and providing some examples. So those two, it's just the big differences, we're contrasting them is monetary value versus non-monetary inherent value. All right. For number 9, this one says contrast the phenotypes of pioneer species and climax species. Explain how these phenotypes help pioneer species colonize a new site or help climax species persist during competition. So going back to the previous question, someone asked, well, we need to know the different types of instrumental values. You will have to be able to give an example or two, or if you're given examples, say in a multiple choice, you might be say, pick the answer that represents an instrumental value. All right, so we're talking about pioneers and climax species. There was a table in cogbooks that contained what, 3, 6, 8 different traits that it focused on. So I'm just going to go through that table and we can compare and contrast the different phenotypes. So when we talk about number of seeds, how does it differ between early succession or pioneer species with late succession climax species?
Pioneer species have a lot of small seeds, whereas the climax species has a little bit or a smaller amount of larger seeds.
Yeah, and that covers the second phenotype, right? So for number of seeds, early succession is going to have many, late succession is going to have few, and for seed size, early succession, they're going to generally be small, and late succession, they're going to generally be large. And this goes into the next phenotype. What is the mode of dispersal for these organisms? So how do early succession species get spread?
By like weather, like wind, or like getting stuck to animals.
Yeah, those are the two examples I found, right? Generally through wind or through getting stuck to animals. And if they're small in size, it makes sense, right? They can get picked up by the wind a lot easier. And if there's a lot of them and they're small, they can pretty easily get stuck to animals. But what about the mode of dispersal for late succession climax species? So someone said spread by gravity or eaten by animals. So gravity seems pretty straightforward, right? We can think of maybe fruits fall to the ground and their seeds then have some nutrition from the rotting fruit itself, and it can be buried in the ground at a short dispersal. But what does it mean? How does being eaten by an animal benefit late succession organism?
Because usually they're not like digested and they come out.
No, exactly, right? The fruits maybe are digestible and the animals swallow the seeds, and the seeds are indigestible, right? So then they pass them and the animal walks away. And instead of having some of the nutritional value from the fruit that's rotting, they have the nutritional value from the animal waste with the seeds, right? That provides nutrients. And it spreads them. So it's just that they can't eat them. Yep. What about the root to shoot ratio? So that's just comparing how much of a plant is made up of roots and how much of the plant is the shoots or like the stems and the leaves.
Don't the pioneer species have longer root systems so they can reach the harder, I guess, to reach nutrients versus like the climax species where essentially the nutrients are more easily accessible so they can grow taller versus having a deeper root system?
I think the way I heard it is the opposite, right? Where the early succession species are going to have more shoots because they're going to land in inhospitable areas potentially, and they grow rapidly above the ground and grow quickly versus you're going to have more roots in a late succession species like large trees. They're going to plant themselves deep in that environment and have a more nutritious, fertile soil. What about growth rate then?
Pioneer species usually grow really fast, whereas climax species grow like slow.
Yep, so just fast versus slow, right? And that makes sense because as we just mentioned, these early succession species, they grow, they have to grow they're small and they produce a lot of seeds, so they don't have to grow, they don't have to wait as long to produce their offspring. They don't have to invest as much energy into producing large offspring or large seeds. What about size at maturity? How does that differ between early succession and late succession?
I feel like it relates to their growth rate. Like climax species grow slow, but they grow like larger, and pioneer species grow fast, but they're kind of like a small species.
Yep, I would agree with those statements. And then shade tolerance is the last trait that Cogwoods talked about. How does that differ between early succession and late succession? Someone said high shade tolerance for climax, and then that would, by default, would answer low shade tolerance to early succession. And I would agree. Let's talk a little bit about that mechanism. So is that a benefit to late succession or a benefit to early succession? Someone said a benefit to late succession. I would agree. Why would that be a benefit? So someone said there's more competition with late succession. Can you expand on that? What do you mean by more competition with late succession? I would agree that it definitely has to do with competition. So we know by the names, right? Early succession species are going to get to the habitat first, and then late successions are going to get there later, right? I mean, that's pretty straightforward. So someone said they could dominate because they are more mature, but I would eventually, yes. But when the early succession species get there, they start to grow and they're further along in maturity than the late succession species come, and they have to grow with and through the early succession species. So being tall, have more shade, so having shade tolerance would be ideal. So if they're growing, so we say we got some grasses growing in a field, right? And then a tree seed is underneath it. And that's a late succession species that arrived later. Because the tree species is shade tolerant, it can grow under that grass and then grow eventually tall, as someone said, above it. And then what it can do is it can shade out that grass because that grass is not tolerant. So we can actually help the late succession species outcompete the early succession species. And hence that's why we see a turnover in species composition when we transition from early to late succession organisms. Yeah, somebody said it's an example of, it could be an example of inhibition where it prevents pioneer species plants from surviving. Exactly. Because if late succession species, if it was opposite, right? If the late succession species were not shade tolerant and their seeds landed in the grass, they would never sprout because they would get blocked from the sun from the grass. So they would not be able to compete. So it's an adaptation that these late succession species have to eventually outcompete the early succession species. Any questions about these phenotypes? You know, you could see this the questions from this, I would imagine, in a number of ways. You could be given a multiple choice question and asked, find the example that or the phenotype that describes a late succession species. You could be given a short answer question that says compare and contrast the phenotypes from late succession to early succession species. So you be expected to be explained not only identify these, but explain the why part. All right. Why don't we go on to number 10 then? And this is the one that talks about identify factors that determine the maximal length of a food chain in a community. Explain why aquatic communities usually have more trophic levels than terrestrial communities. So what factors determine the length of a food chain in a community? So someone said biomass. I agree. I think that's a good starting point. What about that biomass? What happens to it in that community? If somebody says productivity, I would agree with that too. So they said the biomass gets consumed. Yep, that's where I'm going with this. And what happens when biomass gets consumed? That's a transfer of what? A transfer of biomass, or you could also call it a transfer of something else. Why do we need to eat? Energy, exactly, right? So there's an energy transfer, and it starts with the producers at the bottom, right? Generally, if this is a bottom-up effect, you have producers that produce that biomass, and it gets consumed by consumers at different levels, and you have sometimes primary, secondary, tertiary, quaternary, as many consumers as that ecosystem can sustain. What are some of the terms from cogbooks that talks about energy transfer through an ecosystem of the food web or food chain? Yeah, so consumption efficiency, right? That's one of them. So this is where the efficiencies kind of become a part of this, right? There's assimilation efficiency, net production efficiency, and ultimately ecological efficiency, right? What is assimilation efficiency? So the percent of consumed energy that is assimilated, right? I would agree. And what do we mean by assimilated? What's another way we could describe that?
Absorbed.
Yeah, that's the word I would use, right? So you eat the food and you do two things with it. We talked about this in the last office hours a little bit, right? You either absorb it and keep it in you and turn it into energy, or you pass it as waste. So for these, why don't we take it? We'll take the opportunity to go into the question in a little more detail and go back to some of the activities or some of the calculations, because these are some of the equations that I would recommend writing down, because you will have to do some efficiency calculations. And the way they're set up is they're going to look very similar to what you saw in cogbooks. Let me share my screen. All right, so it's a good idea to know what the definitions are, and you're going to be able to write down these equations, so you don't have to memorize the equation, but you have to know what it means, right? So Cogbooks does a good job of giving you the equations and then showing you how they build off of each other. And then where is it? They have a pretty good example where they give you, yeah, so with the efficiencies, it's going to be 4 equations. And then, yeah, right here, this is a good example of what you will see on the exam. You're going to see some type of table like this that's pre-filled out. To some extent, it might be missing one of the columns, or it might just be give you some of the columns, and it's going to have you say, calculate the consumption efficiency for the terrestrial ecosystem, the stream ecosystem, and then this third ecosystem. And it might have you then, after calculating consumption, or it might just ask you to calculate assimilation efficiency. And you have to know the steps that you have to calculate the consumption efficiency first, and then you can calculate the assimilation efficiency. So you might have to do a couple steps to get to the answer that you're looking for. And if this is part of a short answer, it might ask you to compare and say which of the systems has, you know, a greater assimilation efficiency. I would agree that it should be pretty straightforward calculations if you have the equations written down and you know the order of the equations, right? Because say you just write down assimilation efficiency, but maybe you didn't write down one of the other equations, or you don't know how to get from one equation to the other. So go through this example in Cogbooks again, right? And what they do is, I mean, we can walk through it together, pretty straightforward real quick. If they ask for, so ultimately here, they're asking us to calculate everything, right? Because it's practice. So to get to the last one, the ecological efficiency, we're given types of energy in the terms of net production available in the lower trophic level. So you could almost argue this is, you know, a type of biomass, right? That somebody said earlier. Consumed energy is, you know, the eaten energy. The assimilated energy is the absorbed energy, and the net production energy is the energy they have left over to use for production. So this is module 5 T20, and then energy efficient or energy efficiency limits trophic levels. Sorry. And then for solving the first one, consumption efficiency, that's consumed energy. So we would just find that would be 250 for the terrestrial ecosystem, right? And on the bottom is the net production energy of the next lower trophic level, and that's this one, the net production energy, and that's 50, oh no, wait, sorry, I can't read. It's the net production available in lower trophic level, just as it says right there. So make sure to take your time on the exam and read what is actually in the equation, as I did a good example of not doing that. And then it would just be the 250 divided by the 1000, and that would either, you could put 0.25 or 25%. And the answers are going to be percentages. I mean, if you want to keep it like that, to just be easy, because they are efficiencies. By third column, do we mean this, the stream ecosystem column? It depends on the question, right? If this one just said compare the terrestrial ecosystem with ecosystem, I'm not sure why they call it just ecosystem, then the third column wouldn't matter. But if it said compare all 3 ecosystems, then it would. So again, that's one where you got to pay attention to the question. Which ones are you comparing all 3? Are you just comparing 2 of them? So just, again, take your time and make sure to read through it and double check that you answered the question that's being posed. Yes, you will be given a completed table. So you will have the numbers. Because there's no way to calculate these as far as Cogbooks told you. Because this is energy in joules, and the reason that it's percentages without labels is because you're dividing by the same units, right? So it's energy in joules divided by energy in joules. Both joules get crossed out, and then you're just left with a unitless number, which is the percentage efficiency. So it said, are we going to be asked to calculate residence time? That is a possibility, as there were examples of calculating that in Cogbooks. And those are these calculations right here. But again, you would be given the information. So energy present and a trophic level comes from that table. And then net productivity would come from the table too. So it's possible.
Do we need to know the equation for like net primary productivity?
Which books is that from again?
It's the same one. I think it's like right before all the like energy
Oh, yeah.
equations. It just is like net primary productivity is equal to gross primary productivity minus respiration.
Yeah, so that would be an example of another equation that you calculated in Cogbook. So that would be a possible to be asked questions to calculate that. But again, you would be given the information needed to do that calculation. It's just knowing how to plug it into the equation. Yeah, and yeah, this was the part that covered it. So this would be that equation. Is there anything in secondary? No, this is just, secondary is just talking about adjusted and assimilated energy, which we've talked about. So there's no equation with secondary production. All right, so are there any questions about the efficiency calculations? Is anything in Cogbook's not clear on how to do those calculations? Because there was the one activity that had you quantify conversion efficiencies, and then it had feedback where it gave you the answers. So we can talk about those if anybody has questions about it. Or so someone said, can we write the net primary production equals GPP minus respiration? Yeah, that's an equation. You could write that. What I don't want to see is descriptions of what that means. Like, the discussion we're having, don't put those notes on there, but you can definitely, if there's any type of equation in Cogbooks, you can write out the equation and the words that are in the equation, just not long descriptions discussing the equations. I think, just so we're all on the same page real quick, we're moving on. This was the activity. Again, you were given the table. It showed you, the first set of equations, just pulling the numbers from the table, getting your values. And then it gives you the answers down here for the lake ecosystem and the stream ecosystem. And it gives you all the additional, you would have multiple, you could have 3 answers, one for each ecosystem, is the way that it did it. Are there any more questions or anything not clear about the efficiency calculations? All right. If not, let's go back to question 10. So we kind of elaborated this question with the different efficiencies. The second part now talks about explain why aquatic communities usually have more trophic levels than terrestrial communities. So what's different about aquatic communities from terrestrial communities? It typically gives aquatic communities more trophic levels. So think of it as a longer chain. So it said, unlike trees and shrubs, algae have short lives with rapid reproduction, and they are consumed in large numbers. I would agree with that statement, but what about, let's use this as an example. What's different about algae and trees structurally that would cause a difference in efficiencies? So I would agree that algae and trees are both biomass that is consumed in the terrestrial and the aquatic environment. So someone said algae are easy to digest. I absolutely, yep. What about trees are not easy to digest? Or I should say maybe is how much of algae can we digest and how much of a tree can we digest? Is that different?
I guess animals can digest like all of algae, but with trees, like you don't see a lot of animals that can eat wood versus the leaves or any fruit that a tree may drop.
Yeah, exactly. Most all of algae, so you eat a pound of algae, almost that entire pound is something that your body can break down easily and use for energy. Now, if you take a random chunk of a tree that's a pound, is all of that chunk going to be edible and usable for energy? I think we're going, yeah, someone said no, right? The bark, not a lot of that's edible. Some plants, the entire woody part, so the shoot or the roots, like animals don't eat, they just eat the leaves from that. So maybe if they're eating the leaves off of a branch and they eat part of the branch, that woody part fills them up, but it's not easily digested at all, and they get very little energy from it. So if we link this to the efficiencies, which system do you think is a more efficient as far as like digestion and assimilation?
The aquatic ecosystem.
Yeah, so if we start saying that the consumption efficiency could be equal, right? We eat a pound of algae and a pound of a tree, but the assimilation efficiency is where we're going to start to see differences, right? With the algae, that assimilation efficiency is going to be very high, and with the tree, the terrestrial system, that assimilation efficiency is going to be relatively low. And then how does that play into the other efficiencies? Yeah, so somebody said the aquatic systems have high ecological efficiency. Yes. So as we mentioned just before, these efficiencies build off of each other. And if you have a break now at differing at assimilation efficiency, it's going to affect the net production efficiency, and ultimately it's going to affect the ecological efficiency, right? And that's the percentage of net production from one trophic level to the next lower trophic level. So in simpler terms, as energy goes from one trophic level to the next, in aquatic systems, we're saying that it's more is assimilated, having a higher ultimate ecological efficiency, less energy is lost through each trophic level. And if you have the less energy or the more energy that is passed on, the odds are that it can be transferred to the next trophic level. So if you have high efficiencies and you lose little energy, you can have more trophic levels. But in the terrestrial system, if we have low efficiencies, that energy is going to go to zero pretty quickly, only after maybe a few trophic levels, maybe 2 or 3, 4 if we're lucky. Or aquatic, it could be 5, 6, 7 possibly, depending on the environment. So we said a key trait is digestibility. It's higher in aquatic, and part of that is the structure. Like a tree is a very large, complex organism that has different parts. Some are edible, some are non-edible, where algae is a very simple organism that has very similar parts and is very, generally edible as the entire organism. What else is maybe different between algae and maybe trees or some shrubs that makes them easy or difficult to consume. Algae grow really fast and are small. I would agree. So a smaller organism is easier to consume than, say, a large organism. Algae grows fast, so it replenishes itself really quickly. Those are true. I had one other additional idea in mind. What about when we think of structure? We saw they're smaller. So yes, so somebody said defenses. That's the one that I was looking for. A lot of times trees and shrubs have physical defenses like thorns or chemical compounds, where most aquatic organisms, plants, do not. Yeah, plants are more complex organisms too, so their internal cellulose and complex molecules further can be harder to digest. Yeah, so knowing the structural differences, knowing the ecological and other efficiency differences are how we have ultimately a differing number of chains or links, if we want to call it, in these different systems. So does that make sense now? How aquatic can have longer systems or have a longer food chain than a terrestrial ecosystem can? All right, just to rehash, digestibility, is higher in aquatic. The amount that is edible is higher in aquatic. There are few to no defenses in aquatic. And ultimately, it's this aquatic are a more efficient system, and they lose less energy between each trophic level. And if you maintain that energy, the longer your food chain can be. Okay, why don't we go ahead and go on to number 11 then? We've kind of hinted at this one a little bit through our discussions. So this one says, describe the potential effects of reintroducing a keystone species into an ecosystem. Give an example from recent history and conclude whether the reintroduction increased or decreased biodiversity. So what do keystone species typically do for ecosystems? Are they positive or are they negative?
Positive.
Yeah, they're positive. And how are they positive for that system? What effects do they generally have? So they stabilize it. Where do they stabilize it? So they, in terms of diversity.
They can keep certain species in check. So like otters keeping sea urchins in check, because otherwise they would go wild and just eat all the sea kelp, which provides benefits for other animals.
I think that's a good example. So when we say keep animals in check, we tend to think of keystone species as kind of towards the top of a ecosystem, right? And they keep organisms that are below them in the ecosystem in check. So if we have two organisms that compete for food in the middle level, and one of them, say organism A, is really a better competitor than organism B, but because the keystone predator species there is a predator in this hypothetical, it predates on both A and B, and it keeps A from overgrowing in population and outcompeting B. But without the keystone species, A could outcompete B and remove B from that system. So that would, what would that do to the diversity then?
Increase it.
Yeah, so generally they increase diversity and they stabilize an ecosystem at high levels of diversity. And bringing it to balance is a good way to put it. So someone mentioned sea otters with urchins and kelp as one example from Cogbooks. What's another example that Cogbooks went over? So wolves in Yellowstone, right? California condor is another one. Yeah, so they talked about a few examples. So you might be asked a question to describe how a keystone species maybe affects an ecosystem. So being able to give an example and then walk through the steps of that example might be beneficial. So according to Cogbooks, what happened when the wolves were exterminated by humans from Yellowstone? What was an organism that was like immediately affected, and how did that organism respond at the population level and behaviorally? Yeah, so deer or elk populations they talked about, right? When the wolves were removed, the wolves were the top predator of the elk. And with the wolves gone, the elk behaviorally changed where they didn't need to hide in the forested areas anymore to avoid the wolves. They could spend time in the open and graze on grasses and willows, right? Yeah, and when they were able to freely graze uninterrupted, they consumed more energy and they were able to increase their numbers and reproduce at a higher rate. And that increased consumption even further. And what they ended up doing is having this big trickling effect, right? Where they removed a lot of the vegetation from the riverbanks. And what happens to rivers when you remove vegetation from its banks? There's a few possible answers, right?
Didn't this affect like the beavers building dams?
Yeah, because when the deer ate all the vegetation, what did that take away from the beaver?
Food to consume.
Yeah, it took away their food and it took away trees because they were eating the saplings by the bank too. And they weren't allowing the trees to regenerate after the beavers cut them down. So the beavers ran out of food and they ran out of trees to build their lodges and they ran out of trees to build dams. And what did that do to the rivers structurally? With no dams or anything disrupting their flow.
Increased?
Yeah, it increased the flow. And what does increased water flow do to the banks? Yeah, somebody says it destroys the banks that don't have structural integrity. So that's where I was going with the plants. Removing the plants from the banks themselves takes the roots out of that soil and it makes the soil looser. And if you now have loose soil with faster flowing water, you're going to get erosion. So it's going to actually turn these meandering rivers into straighter, faster flowing rivers. And that took away a lot of aquatic habitat, right? So frogs, for example, do well in slow moving water in these deeper pools. They don't do well swimming like a fish all the time. Some of the fish that depended on these pools as well to have their nests and reproduce, their nests got washed away, right? They couldn't reproduce. So it really lowered the species diversity in the aquatic environment. And a lot of those aquatic species are food to other organisms such as birds and heron. And if those animals don't have food, they kind of leave the environment. So you can see this trickle down effect kind of drove the diversity down heavily, just thinking the aquatic side, but even on the terrestrial side, now that the wolves are gone, we're talking about keeping organisms in check. Coyotes are considered a predator or a mesopredator, so not a top predator, but they still eat other organisms, so they're a type of predator. Their numbers grew large and they were able to, because they didn't have the wolves around, they decimated like the small mammal population, even some of the birds around. And then what happened to the environment when the wolves were reintroduced, when they brought them back?
Elk moved into the mountains and like the vegetation started to grow back.
Exactly. That's many things happen, right? The simplest answer is the ecosystem reversed. It went back to a higher diversity, healthier state because the wolves, the first thing they did is they affected the elk's behavior, right? They drove them out of the open. So it allowed the grasses to recover. It allowed the willows and some of the shrubs to recover. And that allowed the banks to sturdy up. And again, exactly, it allowed the beavers to come back because they now had a food source. And when they had a food source and trees regrew, they could dam up the water and slow it down, flood some of the areas and create these deeper pools, which increases aquatic diversity. The wolves also decreased the elk population in numbers because they ate them. They also competed and outcompeted the coyotes and drove their numbers down. So that relieved some competition, some predation pressure on lower level organisms. And everything we said before, it just had this big reverse effect and ultimately increased the biodiversity of that environment again to historical levels. So I think we concluded, right, that the reintroduction of the wolves as a keystone species helped increase biodiversity in this environment. Are there any questions with number 11, or anybody want to discuss one of the, the other examples that were brought up?
Do we have to know each like specific case example, or just knowing like one and how it works is good enough?
Knowing one well will be pretty good for the exam.
Okay.
And you're not going to have to list every single detail. I would aim for, having a solid 4 or 5 points you can bring up and how they're linked together. The more connections you can, answer, and like a potential short answer, the higher the odds of getting full credit are.
Did you go over the carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus cycle activities in the last office hours at all?
We did go over some of them, but if you want, we can go over some specific ones again.
Yeah, if you could do that, it'd be awesome.
Which ones would you like to go over?
The carbon and nitrogen were the trickier ones.
Okay, there's a couple of each. So I guess if you just name one, we can just do that.
I don't have that cog books open at the moment.
How about carbon
So it doesn't-
cycle 2A?
Yeah, it doesn't really matter which one, they're all similar.
All right. Let me share my screen real quick. Okay, so for this one, just pick kind of a random one. There's a couple of things here. So this one doesn't give us the names, it gives us the chemical compounds. So we're gonna have to be able to recognize the chemical compounds and know a few things about those chemical compounds. So what do we have in these first two? What's this box?
Carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide.
Yeah, and because we have arrows, we know that we have carbon monoxide with the single O is being converted to carbon dioxide. So what that means is we have some gas exchange here, right? Because we know that we have to recognize that carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide are gases. where would we see, which picture would show us gas exchange?
The atmosphere.
Yeah, right. So yeah, people in the chat are saying the bottom right. And why is it the atmosphere? Like,
Because gases are more present.
yeah, simple answer exactly though. We have, this is air where we have a lot of high level of gases. So it's gas exchange most likely here because we have, this is, the edge of the atmosphere and the turnover around where we enter space in the atmosphere, we're gonna have some gas exchange. What's going on in the second box? We know we have carbon dioxide, right? We said that from the first one, and that's being converted into, what is this? What is C6H12O6? Okay, so somebody said glucose. That is the correct answer. To think of it in the simplest terms is it's an organic molecule, so we're dealing with carbon, so we could simply call it organic carbon, or we could call it by its name and call it glucose. Where would CO2 be being converted into organic carbon? So someone said in plants, I would agree. I see 3, maybe 4 pictures that have something to do with plants. Right, I mean, this looks like underwater plants to me. There's grass here. Fruit is from a plant. These look like plant cells. So someone said top left. And we're talking about, what do plants do? Like, we got to think about their life, when they're functioning, how do they go get CO2 and turn it into organic carbon or glucose? What process does this involve? Right, photosynthesis, right? In photosynthesis, plants breathe in or take in carbon dioxide, and they produce more compound molecules, like sugars or the glucose in this case. So this is, at the cellular level, plants are going to be producing organic carbon. And what is this bottom one? So we now have seen these two. We have organic carbon, but now with the arrow, it produces CO2. So it looks like the breakdown of organic carbon into CO2. Where would that be happening? What breaks down CO2 and gives off, what breaks down glucose or organic carbon and gives off CO2 in the process? So yeah, eating. So there's some sort of eating process. So somebody said decomposition and consumption. Now I would agree, right? That when a mammal in this case is eating organic carbon in the form of sugars, so there's glucose in this fruit, they're respiring and they're breathing out CO2 in the process. But when an organism breaks down, it also is organic carbon that's being broken down, and as it decomposes, it's also releasing CO2. And what's going on in this third box? So we got a new compound here. We have carbon dioxide as CO2, but now it's being converted into H2CO3. So what is H2CO3?
Is it carbonic acid?
Yes. Now we have a gas. And when we think of acids, what state do we typically think of them as? At least at room temperature in most chemistry.
Liquid.
Yeah, I would agree that they're generally going to be liquids. So if we have a gas and a liquid, what image is showing potential interactions of a gas and a liquid? Yeah, the waves, right? Water turning over with air. Just to go back to a question in the chat real quick. So decomposition and eating both release CO2, and yes, that is correct. And for this one, yeah, when we have, and this is not an in-depth thing, but for the sake of cogbooks and the level of chemistry in this, these modules in the exam, knowing that this is an acid is going to have some form of liquid in the photos, a pretty safe bet. So what's going on here? Now we have two new compounds. What's CaCO3?
Calcium carbonate.
Yeah, we have calcium carbonate, and now we have HCO3. What is that? Yeah, bicarbonate, exactly, right? Where we think of calcium carbonate being broken down into a simpler compound, into a bicarbonate, where does that process take place? In sedimentation, right? And where do we see sedimentation? Yeah, the bottom photo. So this is the bottom of either a lake or an ocean where sediment settles, and that's where we're going to find the storage of calcium carbonate and the breakdown into bicarbonate. All right. And then this one, it's kind of similar to the previous one we had, right? We have organic carbon or glucose of some sort broken down or converted into carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide. So this one up here was just carbon dioxide, but this is both with an and, carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide. And what's another way to break down organic carbon? We said you could eat it. It could be from a dead animal, or exactly from combustion. You can burn it. So this is a picture of, looks like some type of oven or furnace, a fire. And that would be the breakdown here. Let's double check our answers. Yeah, and that's correct. And the big difference is if it breaks down only into CO2, it's because you have a living organism being broken down by either consumption or decomposition, versus if it's carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide, that's going to come from fire burning it, from combustion. Was there another activity that anybody wanted to go over? There are several from this section.
I have a question. Do we have to know like the actual like cycles, like the water cycle, the carbon, the nitrate, the phosphate?
Those are not going to be as important as a lot of these activities below.
Okay, so just mainly knowing like how it's transferred in an ecosystem.
Yeah, you're not going to be asked to describe like the entire process, but you could be shown a picture maybe like this with one missing block and asked in a multiple choice, what is happening between, in this area right here, but it won't have you fill out the whole thing. And it'll be more focused on the carbon, phosphorus, and nitrogen cycle than it will be on the water cycle in general.
Okay, that helps. Thank you.
Sure, we can look at one with the nitrogen cycle. Which one is this? 3A. Okay, so you will see questions on the exam that are like this, where you're going to be given two images and you're going to be asked very similar questions along these lines. So you can see the answers in this just based on that I've already gone through it, but we can still talk about the why. So for this one, it says, which of these parts of the ecosystem will contain more nitrogen in the form of NO in a river or in a picture of the air? And the way to think about these pictures is this is a body of water and this is air, and it kind of relates to what we were talking about earlier. So we have to know a little bit about the chemical properties of the compound. So what is NO? It's a gas, I would agree. So it's going to be in the form of a gas. And as far as the exam, that's probably as much as you really need to know. If you can recognize NO as a gas and you don't know that it's nitric oxide, you'll be okay. So where do you think we're going to find a gas more frequently then? In water or in the air? In the air, exactly. So knowing that chemical like background and would help us to know where to find it. So then let's just go through all of these and just kind of walk it through. So which of these parts of the ecosystem will contain more nitrogen in the form of NO3? So what do we think of when we think of NO3? It's not an acid, but there's something about it that makes it similar. So it's NO3 is nitrate. Yeah, exactly. And what we know about nitrates is they are water soluble. So if something's water soluble, where do you think you're likely to find it? In the air or in the water? Exactly, in the water. So it's just recognizing, really the important is knowing what state these chemical compounds are, or if they're water soluble or not. That's going to be, give you pretty close to the answer almost every time. This NH4 is ammonium, right? And knowing that that is also water soluble is why we would find it in the water. I think I actually put the wrong answer down for this one. Let's go to the feedback just to double check that. Yes, so the answer is A. So it is water, even though I have B marked. And then the last one, I guess there's a couple more. This one says, so this is the form of N2. And we know, we can see it, the answer is B. And why is N2 found in, ecosystem that would represent figure B more than A? Exactly, somebody said N2 is a gas. And this one, number 5, is a little bit different because now we have a picture of the air and we have a picture of an animal. So this says, which of these parts of the ecosystem will contain nitrogen in the form of organic nitrogen? And the answer you can see is B, but why is organic nitrogen found more in higher levels in an animal than it is in the air? Yes, I would agree. They consume it from plants. When we think of the term organic in these modules, we think of something coming from a living thing, right? And we have a living organism that eats other living organisms. In this term, it's a plant that it generally eats. So we know that they get nitrogen from the plants. So they would have higher levels in themselves than there would be nitrogen floating in the air in the form of organic nitrogen. Was there any other kind of activities that anyone wanted to go over? Let me just try one from the phosphorus cycle since we're here. So this again, it's visually just a little bit different than the ones we've done, which is good. This will show us some diversity. When we look at the images, and some of them are similar to the ones we've seen, some are different. So let's just go through and discuss the why of these. So this one says production of organic phosphorus. Which one do we think has the production of organic phosphorus? We're saying the plant. And again, we got to be careful because there's at least 4 photos with plants in it. But pretty sure you're on the right track.
The plant molecules on the right.
Yeah, so this one is images of the cells, right? So at the cellular level is where we're going to get organic materials produced, right? So this would be the plant cells producing organic phosphorus. What about consumption of organic phosphorus? This is the koala because it's eating organic phosphorus, so it's eating something organic living, right? Or at least once living, in the forms of these eucalyptus leaves, presumably. What about decomposition of organic phosphorus? So with organic phosphorus, it has to have a living thing. This is the dead fish. It was once living, and now it's decomposing. What about circulation of phosphate? So someone said the beach. And I would argue this is maybe not the best picture because they don't have the biggest waves in them that we're seeing before, but I think they're just trying to show water intersecting with like a terrestrial environment and it causes some level of circulation. We know that phosphate is water soluble, so it's going to be circulating with the water in the air. What about storage of phosphate? So someone said the bottom right and someone said the rocks, which I think would be the top left.
The sediment on the bottom right.
Yeah, so when we think of storage, it's generally going to have pictures of some sort of underwater scene where sedimentation has happened and this has settled to the bottom and is being currently stored. And it's stored there until it's disrupted, either by this diver, maybe volcanic activity, or a shifting of tectonic plates, or maybe even some other living organisms that dig in there and release the phosphate. What about weathering? That's a new term. We haven't heard that in the other 2 cycles. Maybe let's start with, someone said the top left, I would agree, but what do we mean by weathering? What does that consist of?
Like erosion.
Yes, I would agree. What can cause erosion?
Water, wind.
Those are the 2 main ones. The other types of weathering could be breakdown of the structure due to like excessive solar radiation. So I don't know if anybody's ever had like patio furniture that's deteriorated over the years because it gets beat on by the sun, blown on by the wind, and rained on periodically by water. So those are all forms of weathering. And we can see in this picture here that we have rocks that have been carved up and exposed due to different forms of weathering, probably all the above, the sun, the wind, and the water. And then assimilation of phosphate. So we've heard of assimilation. We said that it means absorption. So the question would be, had it not be the last choice, what is something that's doing some absorbing? Yeah, roots, they absorb water and nutrients from the soil, right? So they would assimilate phosphate. Yeah, we got them all correct. Is there any other specific activity from these cycles that anybody wants to go over? Because this was good because we saw them in different formats where we have, you could be given the words in your multiple choice, you could be given the chemical compounds in your multiple choice. You could be asked to describe what's happening. you could be given a couple pictures and be, asked where you find more of one substance than another. And we talked about why we would find the different volumes or concentrations of substances. I would just recommend, practice these again. So somebody said, can we go over the water cycle? We can definitely do that. Everybody can see the water cycle on this side, right? Okay. And then this one is simply just matching, right? We're given the one at a time, the terms down here. So where do we think surface flow would go? I guess, what do we mean by surface flow? Maybe that can help, because picking the box is going to be a little difficult. So surface flow is this, water flowing on the surface of the land. So that would be this right here, and what it's referring to is this river, this runoff that's coming down on top of the land. And then the next one is transpiration, right? And what happens during transpiration? Where does the water come from and where does it go? So someone said from the clouds of the mountains. Would that be in the form of like rain? Are we talking?
Is it from the plants?
Yeah, this is actually kind of like respiration, right? This is when plants lose water to the environment. So this would go here. Then what is sublimation? How is water transferred in that case? So from the mountains to the sky, I would agree. So somebody said snow. So what two states are involved? Like physical states of water in sublimation? It goes from a what to a what? Yeah, solid to a gas, right? Because a liquid to a gas is evaporation, a solid to a gas is sublimation. So that would be here, where they're trying to show that there's snow right here going into so a solid going into the air would be a gas. Then what's happening with plant uptake? What do they mean by that?
Absorbing water from like soil,
Yes, what is absorbing it?
the roots.
Yeah, right? So you have plant roots that are absorbing water. And that would just be this box, I believe. Yeah, that's the closest one. And then percolation. What's going on with percolation? Something to do with the ground, I would agree. And the water sitting, it does have something to do with the water sitting in the lake. So percolation is the movement of water through the soil itself. All those statements are correct. almost to the actual definition, right? So have we heard of a percolator that has to do with coffee? Anybody familiar with that kind of older technology or that way to brew coffee sometimes? What happens at that? Yeah, it kind of filters it, right? So you have water that you put in the back, drips it through the coffee or the soil, and then it drips into another body of water. So you have water in the lake, as somebody mentioned, it goes through the soil into the underground body of water. So it goes through, uses the soil as almost a type of filter. Yeah, it would lead to the groundwater. So it's water through soil to more water. So it's, yeah, so it would be this arrow right here that should be, so these boxes are kind of covering the diagram. So make sure to take a look at the actual figure too. All right, what about snow melt runoff? That one should be pretty straightforward, right? That's just where the snow melts and turns from a solid into a liquid and runs down the side of the mountain. So for sake of ease, that would be this right here. So the snow on the mountain going down, and eventually when it gets off the mountain, it would turn into surface flow. So that, you know, some of these are directly connected. And what about groundwater flow? Where would we see that on this diagram? Yeah, the bottom left, and the kicker is kind of the arrow, right? It's in water and it's showing the water's flowing and it's underground. So groundwater is just water that's under the ground and it's flowing. So having an arrow indicates there's a direction, and in this case, it's moving from groundwater into a larger body of water. And what about condensation? There's already a good hint on this figure. What's happening with condensation? Yeah, so somebody said clouds forming, right? So over here on the left, they have it on here twice for some reason. You have a smaller cloud building into a bigger cloud. So another place for it is over here, right? You have the condensation, the smaller cloud to the bigger cloud. So it'd be this one right here. And what are we talking about with this one, with transportation? What does that mean as far as the water cycle? Yeah, all that means is clouds moving, exactly. You have, there's an example of it right here, the clouds are moving, and it's the same thing, they're just moving into an area where they're eventually potentially gonna rain. So it's just transportation of water, in this case, in the form of a cloud. And then infiltration. It's our last box, so it's gonna go here. Actually, it's not our last box, sorry. But it goes here. And what that means is it's water coming from the surface into the soil. And then precipitation. What's happening in precipitation? Yeah, precipitation is another word for rain. So you get water in the gas form turning into a liquid and falling out of the sky, essentially, right? So it's just precipitation is the rain. Double check. Yep, and we got them all right. So, are there any specific questions about the water cycle?
How is infiltration and percolation different?
So percolation involves two bodies of water. So you have the lake up here, and it goes through the soil and enters another body of water. So the way you think of it with coffee is you have coffee gets heated up, and then it goes through the coffee grounds and it comes out liquid again into the coffee pot. And infiltration just stays in the soil. It doesn't go in all the way down into the groundwater.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yep. There was a question from the chat. I'm trying to go back to. All right, so the question is, can we go over number 2 in a little more detail from the topics and objectives? Yes, we can do that. So if we go back to question number 2, that one is about analyzing experimental evidence of succession and identify the mechanisms that drive changes from one serial stage to the next. So when scientists were looking at different environments and trying to determine what level of succession they're in, what were some things that they looked at that landscape? Okay, then somebody said talking about case studies, and yes, this is definitely related to the case studies. And Glacier Bay is one of those case studies that they looked at. So this is remembering like being provided evidence potentially, or recalling a study and giving some of the methods that they used and some of the results that they determined were determining early or late succession. So this could be presented in a few different ways. What I was getting at is if scientists, this could be from a specific example, or we could kind of talk about this hypothetically. If scientists go to an environment and look at the organisms, typically the plant organisms there, could they just look at the plants and make a hypothesis or kind of estimate if these are early or late succession species?
Yes.
I would agree. I mean, to be more certain, I would agree they'd have to know more of the history, but didn't we go over a table with morphological features that are generally accepted as early versus late succession species? So what were some of those features, right? If you go up to a plant and it has tons of tiny seeds, would you think that if that plant was really popular, would that provide evidence to early or late succession plants? Yeah, so somebody said seed size, dispersion method, size of plant. Yeah, and to my answer, that would be an example of an early succession. Yeah, so you could go out and comparatively look at those plants and maybe some plants of a nearby region and compare the two, because it has to be comparative, because if there's nothing to compare it to, it's hard to make a judgment, but you could look at the morphology of the plants and get some evidence at the level of succession. So somebody else asked, would the analysis of the ice cores be evidence of succession? That could, yes, I think they talked about how they could use ice cores to look at the different gases that were in the environment, and that could tell a little bit about the succession, because different plants produce different compounds, and if you know the history of the plants in the area, you could know based on the concentrations of those compounds that were in the ice, what level or what kinds of plants were there, and if those were early or late succession species too. So yeah, that's a great example. What else could you do at a community if you were a scientist and you had permission to do things on the land? Instead of observing, you could do what?
disturb the
Yeah,
ecosystem?
you could just, sorry, go ahead, finish.
Oh no, I was just saying like disturbing the ecosystem. Or
Well,
I guess the area, like the case study of the like, what was it, the like mussels and the like seaweed or algae.
Yeah, exactly. And by disturbing it in a more controlled scientific way, what would we call that? Just experimentation, right? You could do experiments on the land, which are disturbing and they can manipulate the environment. And what are two types of experiments that you could do? What could you do to the communities? Exactly. You could remove species and see how the community comes back, or you could potentially add species and see if that affects it too, right? You could add early succession species to a community, and if they all die off really quickly, it's probably evidence that that's a later succession environment because they're getting outcompeted. But if they do really well, maybe then that's an early succession place. Or if you remove some of the bigger plants and different species come in that weren't there originally, you know that maybe you removed some late succession species and it's starting over with newer early succession species. And you can monitor that over time. And if it goes back to the plants that you originally removed, you know that that's the climax species at the end, and then that was evidence for late succession species being removed. And if we want to talk about some of the mechanisms that drive these changes, there was a good case study that involved mussels, snails, and seaweed that somebody mentioned. And this was a manipulative study where they went in and they removed some of the organisms. And did they, when they removed either the mussels or they removed the snails, did they see that the seaweed grew back the same every time?
No.
Yeah, the simple answer is no. They saw that it depended on who was removed and in which order or how much, right? Because that's the mechanism is either maybe the snails were eating the algae, so if they're removed, algae is able to grow really rapidly in places or in coexistence with the mussels. If the mussels are eating the snails and you remove the mussels, then maybe the snails are going to overgraze on the algae, and it's going to cause the algae to, or the seaweed rather in this case, to not come back. So you're going to maybe see a different succession community. So by removing a species and seeing that it comes back differently, you can provide evidence that the species removed is one of the mechanisms for driving succession to be the community that it is. Are there any other questions or anything that anybody wanted to go over?
Can you just like clarify like mechanisms wise? Like, are they like looking for like certain mechanisms, or just like what you said, like, oh, like in that circumstance, like you removed the seaweed and it grew back really fast, so then the mussels like didn't survive as well?
Yeah, the mechanism in that example would be the driving factor for the pattern of succession. So if the snails are eating the algae, and by removing the mussels that eat the snails, and the snails remove the algae, if that community is completely changed into a different successional pattern, the mechanism was the presence of the mussels, right? And the consumption of the algae by the snails. Those are the mechanisms in that experiment that's driving the successional growth. And the successional growth would be like the plant community, in this case, the algae. Does that make sense?
Kind of. So it's just like case specific.
Yeah, every study is going to have a different mechanism that is what is driving the succession.
Okay.
So it could also be maybe that certain environment, say you have two environments that are kind of near each other, and one is at like a climax species level, like it's at the end of succession, and another one seems to always be in intermediate succession. And you're curious, why doesn't the one habitat finish and go to the climax community that I see a couple miles away? And it might be that the one at the climax community is near a lake, so it has more water resources, and maybe the one that doesn't reach climax is in a drier area, and the limiting mechanism in that case would be the environment or the water availability, that it can't support large trees. So kind of think of the mechanism as the limiting or driving factor for that pattern of succession that you observe in that one location.
Okay, I think that makes more sense now.
Okay, good. And then there was an email question that somebody wanted to go over some of the nitrogen cycle activities that I don't think we went over. So we can go over that question. Let me pull it up real quick. They wanted to go over 2A and 2B. Okay, and this is good because these are ones that we did not go over, so a little more practice. So this is 2A is another matching one. We've kind of seen this structure before. And again, you're given the chemical compounds, and we need to know what's going on here. So we can either go two ways. You can describe what's happening in the boxes, or we can describe what's happening in the picture and see what best matches up. So why don't we do it in the reverse order this time? We'll look at the pictures and see if we can find what's going on in the boxes. So what's happening in this first box up here? Right, we have combustion. So what do we start with typically in a combustion situation? Something organic, right? And because now we're in the nitrogen cycle, it's probably going to have to do with organic nitrogen. So I see two possible answers off the bat, where we have organic nitrogen converted into nitric oxide, or we have organic nitrogen converted into ammonium. What does fire usually do to nitrogen? It produces what? So somebody said the release of nitric oxide. Yeah, a gas, exactly where I was going with that. So if we have organic nitrogen broken down to nitric oxide, I think it would be a safe bet to put that one there. And what's happening in this picture? This is a new picture, at least we haven't talked about it today. What is in the picture? So we have, loose dirt. And that's the focus. So there's obviously a hand in there, but that's just holding the dirt. So would you say that soil looks fertile or infertile? fertile, I would agree. And somebody said nitrification is happening here. And I would agree with that. What drives nitrification? What kind of organism? They're probably in the picture, we just can't see them with our naked eye. Exactly, somebody said bacteria. So this is a soil that looks fairly fertile, in a fairly, or a very breathable environment, right? It's not an anaerobic environment. It looks pretty fertile. Presence of bacteria is pretty high. So we said nitrification. So now what are we looking for chemically in the chemical compound if we think of nitrification? And what do bacteria generally give off as a byproduct? It's a pretty potent smell, and I'm sure most people have smelled it before. Someone said top left, and we just said the top left box. My fault. Yeah, typically, they give off ammonia. So this is nitrification of ammonium, right? So this one right here, I would agree. Then what about number 3? This again is kind of a new picture for us. This is lightning. What's happening with lightning? Definitely high energy. I would agree with that. Well, someone said nitrogen fixation. There's a better picture for that, I would say. So this is conversion to nitrate. So this is nitrification, right? What happens during nitrification? So someone said converts to nitrate. I would agree. What is being converted to nitrate? Nitrogen gas. Yeah, so this is, you have nitrogen gas in the environment, and with the high energy of lightning, it can actually drive a nitrification process and cause that atmospheric nitrogen to go into the ground, especially when the lightning hits the ground. So where we have nitrogen gas in 2 places, right? So these possible answers, when we say nitrates, right, we're not talking about ammonium, talking about singly nitrate. So it would be that answer where it's nitrogen to nitrate only. And somebody brought up lightning strong enough to break triple nitrogen bond. I believe you. I'm not positive. My background in nitrogen is not strong enough to confirm that. And what about up here? We have plant cells we've talked about before, right? What are these plant cells? What typically is the end product in these pictures? So someone said, yeah, takes it in a gas and releases organic nitrogen. So usually we have something with organic nitrogen in these, right? That's the product. We have organic carbon, or we have organic phosphorus in the other ones too. So organic nitrogen here would be the product, and it would take in ammonia and nitrates, either one. So there's an or here, and it would convert them into an organic nitrogen. So in this case, it's not assimilation, because assimilation means it's absorbing, and this is rather kind of like giving off organic nitrogen or making producing it. You could say maybe argue that it's assimilating ammonium or nitrates and then converting it. So yeah, I could see how you could bring in assimilation here. The word's not one of the choices, but describing it, that could work. All right, what's going on in this picture? Yeah, exactly. Of decomposition. What do we usually start with in decomposition? Yeah, so our organic nitrogen, organic matter, specifically organic nitrogen, because we're in the nitrogen cycle area, right? So here we have organic nitrogen, and it gives off, ammonium gas. And that's the smell when, everybody, most people probably smelled some form of decomposition. That pretty strong, pungent smell is the ammonium coming off. All right, what's going on in this picture? What are we looking at? Yeah, so we're looking at roots and fungi, and they have an interaction here. What does the interaction do with nitrogen? Yeah, exactly. This is where nitrogen gets fixed. So you have nitrogen gas getting converted into ammonia or nitrates, and it gets fixated in with the plant. And just to kind of back up a step, this one, we said it was decomposition, and it's certainly a picture of a decomposing animal. But what does the nitrogen cycle actually refer to this process as? Within decomposition, it calls it something else. Yeah, mineralization. Right. I just want to make sure we're using the right terms. And to back up again, yeah, this one, just to confirm, would be assimilation as well, where it assimilates, absorbs these two compounds or one or the other, and then converts it into organic nitrogen. All right. And then in the last picture, again, it looks like, there's hands holding up something in the middle. What are we looking at there? Yeah, so some type of dirt, unfertile dirt. So I would say, is nitrogen generally good for plants in the soil, or is nitrogen not good for plants in the soil? If somebody said good with a question mark, I would say it's generally good. I mean, there's obviously, you can have too much of anything, but generally you want to add nitrogen to soil to some level to make the plants grow better. They need nitrogen. It's a limiting resource. So what happens when nitrogen is lost from the soil? Somebody said we have unfertile dirt, right? Yeah, so this would be, what is the process called for when you lose nitrogen? Exactly, denitrification, right? So you have some soil here that doesn't look very fertile, doesn't look like a very good color, like there's bacteria in it, it's not porous. So this would be denitrification of soil, where it's lost nitric oxide or either nitrogen gas, lost nitrogen in the form of nitric oxide or straight nitrogen gas. And where do we tend to see infertile soil or this denitrification process? What types of environments? What type of, so agriculture, hopefully not too bad, because that wouldn't be good for the plants. Where do you tend to see infertile soil? Deserts. And what did we say was living in this soil up here that helps keep it fertile? What organism? Bacteria. What kind of environments kill bacteria? What do bacteria need to live? Yeah, exactly, anaerobic, harsh environments. So high heat from desert could kill off bacteria. Anaerobic environments such as some wetlands where there's no, if it's stagnant water and the mud is you ever walk through that mud that's like kind of liquidy and you stick in it really bad, there's not much oxygen in those environments. So that could be very low quality environments, such as an anaerobic environment or a desert hot environment that kills off the bacteria and it loses the nitrogen then to the environment. All right, let's just double check our answers. Yeah, we got those. Then I want to go over 2B. All right, so this is similar now, but with the chemical compounds again. So let's go through this one. So we've seen some of these pictures before. We talked about lightning and what lightning does. What was the process called again? So it's the opposite of what we just talked about. We just said denitrification, right? When nitrogen leaves the system. What about when lightning uses energy to push nitrogen into the ground, right? That's just nitrification, not nitrogen fixation, but nitrification. And that's the N2NO3, where you have nitrogen from the atmosphere being converted into nitrates and being pushed into the ground via high energy. And then what about this one? We just kind of talked about these soils too, right? So this looks like pretty porous, call it maybe potting soil in this image. It looks pretty fertile. What happens when you have high levels, a good fertile soil, I should say? Which chemical compound do we think is happening here? We said there's bacteria in here that do a process. Yeah, so this would be nitrification again, but it would be a little bit more specific. It would be nitrification of ammonium. So we would be converting ammonium to nitrates. So we start off up here with ammonium and end with the same product as in the previous one, right? So nitrification from lightning takes atmospheric nitrogen gas and turns it into nitrates, where the bacteria can take ammonium and turn it into nitrates and end up with the same product, just a different process. One's high energy lightning and one is through bacteria. And this one we said is some sort of root system, and that we mentioned interacts with fungi. So what does that process do? Yeah, so this is the nitrogen fixation. They get fixated, if you want to call it, in the roots. So this would be nitrogen being fixated, converted into either ammonium or nitrates again. And then with the dead fish, what's going on in this? It's similar to decomposition, but it has a more specific name. Yeah, mineralization, exactly. What do you need to start with for mineralization? Yes, we start with organic nitrogen. So again, we can rule it down to these two. But what is typically a byproduct of the organic nitrogen? What does it give off? To give off nitric oxide gas or ammonium? Yeah, it gives off ammonia gas. And this is a pretty good picture because we can see kind of how compact the soil is. It looks real murky. There's not a lot of vegetation on the bank, so it does not look like real fertile soil, possibly an anaerobic environment. So what's going on here with those descriptions? Yeah, right, this is denitrification. So what has to be a product for denitrification? Generally N2. Is that the only thing that can be produced? Well, nitrates are usually broken down in the process. So it would be nitrates broken down into N2, as we said, but it could also be nitric oxide. So another type of gas lost to the environment. Then what's going on in this photo? Yeah, combustion. We have fire. And what does a fire generally need as a fuel? What can it use as a fuel? So it does release nitric oxide, and it needs organic. Generally, it looks like wood in here, so it doesn't look like a chemical fire. So it looks like an organic fire. So we have organic nitrogen being combusted and released as the gas nitric oxide. And this last one, this is another kind of microscopic image of plant cells. And what is the product we've said is generally organic nitrogen. So they're producing an organic product, and they do that by breaking down either ammonium or nitrates to produce or release an organic nitrogen product. Yep, and we walked through those pretty well. Good job. All right. So that takes care of all the learning materials and the topics, and we've done some activities. Is there any last set of questions that anybody has, or anything that they don't quite understand yet? If not, that's great. We went through a lot again, and we have the first office hours that has some information on there too. If everybody's good, we can call it here. Just you let me know if there's anything else that you want to go over. No problem. I thank you too for coming and participating. I think this is helpful for you and those that can't make these office hours. So thank you all again for the semester. I think this went pretty smoothly. And good luck on the final exam. And I'll be available through message or email, before the exam, or if you have questions about the exam after. So I think we can go ahead and call it a session. Have a good night.